welcome back. You're listening to Weekly Review on TBS EFM. I'm your host, Rob Alahand, and it's time now for Media in Check. This is the part of the show where we talk about important and compelling media issues. And in the studio with us to do that is Angela Jung. Hello, Angela.
Hello, Rob.
And did you have a good week, first of all?
I did have a great week, actually. It's been up and down in terms of temperature and the weather. But
I don't know how to get dressed every morning.
Yes, it's confusing, but it's, a little bit warmer and the spring's definitely here.
I'm happy about that.
A lot of flowers around.
Yeah. So I have a question now. Yes, just before the recording started, we were talking about going out and seeing the cherry blossoms. But my question for you now, you know how there are, our topic today is about categories. So I want to know, out of all of those different categories and things, for me, I'm an AB, and I'm a Year of the Sheep, and I'm a Libra, and I'm a Hufflepuff, and I'm an INFP. So are there any of those kind of groups and categories that you really identify with personally?
I used to be really into blood type when it was the only thing kind of in Korea. Even in the States, I would ask my friends, what's your blood type? And they'll be
nobody knows,
do you
right?
need blood?
Yeah.
But these days, I would say the MBTI. Yeah.
And it's everywhere these days,
It's pretty
isn't
accurate,
it?
I would say.
Yeah. I find all of them a little fun, more as conversation pieces personally. But my personal favorite is which is your Harry Potter house?
Oh,
right?
that one.
I'm a Hufflepuff personally.
You are.
Yeah. But the categories that we're talking about today are not quite as fun as figuring out if you're a Gryffindor or a Slytherin. What are we talking about today?
Yeah, so today we're talking about a term widely used in politics and in the media that might cause conflicts between the genders and generations. And this is quite a contentious topic in Korea these days. So have you heard of the term 이대남?
Now, it's kind of a funny one, right? Because it just means men in their 20s.
Exactly.
And it feels like that shouldn't signify a huge, big, complex thing, but that's sort of what's happening now, right?
Right. So the term is 이대남, which stands for men in their 20s. So as you might know, gender disputes have been at its height recently in Korea. And I think the watershed moment was when a book titled Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, was released and after the movie was shown.
Yeah.
And as much as it was popular among Korean people, I still remember that they stirred a lot of controversies between two genders. And more recently, gender disputes were at their height in the run-up to the presidential election to an extent that voters were actually divided between genders as gender inequality issues were used as a means to win over the hearts of the voters.
Yeah, and of course you'll always find there's always a politician willing to grab any opportunity they can by using the rhetoric of a group if they think that group will vote for them. But I remember when that book came out, and I think it came out in the same year as the that tragic Gangnam stabbing incident. And it sort of brought all of these conversations out into the open instead of just being online, where people started saying, yeah, look at all of these kind of social expectations that women face. We need to talk about it. It wasn't that long after Me Too went through the Western media. And then, the book was so controversial. I remember a K-pop star was photographed just reading the book, and her fans criticized her just for reading the book and saying, "Are you a feminist?" as if feminism is a dirty word. So the gender conflict has kind of shifted, and now there's a group of young men who are kind of arguing that young men are the ones who are facing discrimination and oppression.
Right. So the sentiment against women or feminists is so strong that sometimes I feel I have to be more careful than in the past when I discuss gender issues with the younger generations. And it was frustrating to see all those malicious replies online for posting about gender issues, like you said.
It's a guarantee to bring up some really heated comments online.
Right.
Yeah.
As a person who is aware of the power that the media exert on the public and their perception, I think the media should be more careful about using the term such as 이대남 because it's one of the contributing factors to increased conflicts in society.
Yeah, and sometimes just using that phrase sort of brings up all of those connections
Right.
and gets some people ready for a fight.
Yes. And it seems I'm not alone in this thinking because Korea Press Foundation conducted a survey on 1,000 people in their 20s and 50s on how they perceived on the use of term 이대남 immediately after the presidential election. And the gender ratio of the respondents was 50-50, and each group born in each different decade, they equally accounted for 25% of the total respondents. After being asked how they think about the 5 issues that the term 이대남 might bring about, the largest number of respondents, which was 88.9%, replied terms such as 이대남 and 이대녀 could cause conflict and division between genders and generations. And 85.8% of the respondents also agreed it's not appropriate to put all young men in their 20s into one single category since they have various inclinations and views. So 85% of the survey think there are possibilities that the term 이대남 and this particular age group of men will be used for political purposes.
Yeah, and I remember when Me Too went viral, or soon after, there was the hashtag not all men, where the same sentiment was going around of saying, well, don't generalize every man's behavior by this one group who's noisy on the internet. So it's good that people have noticed that there's this potential for division, I think. And there are a lot of nicknames these days that seem to focus on how people are different. The silver spoon and dirt spoons, or millennials and boomers and zoomers. And sometimes I just wonder who benefits when ordinary people are all labeling each other and pointing fingers instead of saying, hey, we need to get together and work together to make a better society.
Yes, so I've got more notable results. So the survey also shows that 83.2% of the respondents agree that the term 이대남 has been used as a frame by politicians for political intentions by splitting the public. So they can garner more attention and expand the influence over the general public.
Yeah.
And in addition, 82.3% think that the behaviors in some people have been expanded, reproduced, and exaggerated by media coverage, whereas 59.6% agreed that this is a real-life social phenomena based on reality. And another interesting result is among young men in their 20s who think they refer to themselves as 이대남. So 44.1% were found to be conservative, whereas only 8.3% was found to be liberal, and 6.5% to be in the middle.
So you're saying that out of conservatives, 44.1 said, I'm an 이대남.
Yes.
Like identified with the term. Okay,
Right.
I understand.
But then in reverse, among the men in their 20s who do not consider themselves as 이대남, the result was opposite, of course, because 20.6% were conservative, 41.8% being in the middle, and 50% as liberal.
And so these are people saying, no, I'm not that, kind
Right.
of distancing themselves from that label. Okay. So what it sounds like here, again, is that more people have a negative view of that label, but the people who identify with it tend to be a little more conservative.
Yes. So the ratio between people who have negative views to those with positive views of usage of 이대남 was 71.1% against 13.1%, which clearly shows that the overwhelming majority of Korean people think negatively on using the term 이대남.
Okay. Wow. So now, I know that gender was a big issue in this last election, even with promises to eliminate the Ministry of Gender and Equality.
Right.
But I have a question for you, Angela. Do you personally consider yourself a feminist? And as a young woman, how does this issue look from your perspective? I'm a white male dad, and I know how white male dads think about this. I've got my ear to the ground in that area.
Yeah.
But do you think that this negative feeling, do you think that there's real hatred that's developed from young men in their 20s toward women? Do things feel different than they used to?
So unfortunately, I'm not 이대녀 anymore. So I'm 3대녀, I guess. But, and I'm not a very active active feminist, but I would say I consider myself as a feminist who values gender equality because for me personally, feminism or feminist is not very a negative term. So, and I think the gender inequality issue and what's described in the media have been largely exaggerated or distorted even in some cases as if all young men are outright against women, depicting this issue as black and white. But this approach is very short-sighted and doesn't do any good to our society in the long run. So I also saw that before this year's presidential election, a group of men in their 20s and 30s protested on the street holding the sign that says the expression 이대남 is a discriminatory term that should disappear from our society. The group called 행동하는 보통 남자들, which is ordinary men in action, was created voluntarily online to express one voice. And they were united in thinking that there's no such thing as 이대남. They argue that despite diversity among them, some men who have an anti-feminist views had been wrongly described in the media as if they represent the entire young male population. So generalization is always, it's never good. They raise a question. So I don't have bad feelings or hatred toward women. Then can't I be 이대남? So Mr. Kim, a member of this ordinary people in action, men in action, said instead of instigating hatred against each gender, the political circle and media should put into serious thoughts into what young Korean men really hope in achieving the true gender equality and address structural problems and come up with measures to benefit the vulnerable when discussing policy measures. So all we see is a policy that criticizes women or men and puts them in distress. So I completely agree with what he said.
Now, I teach young men, right? In my other job, I teach young men, and I see the frustration that the world they're looking at is not the world their fathers were looking at when they graduated.
Right.
And that frustration is real and it's deserved. But measuring all young men by the meanest online comments that young men make is just as unfair as measuring feminists by the meanest online comments feminists make. And that's not a path to starting the conversation where we can actually fix these things. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. So we may have to follow this up in a future episode. Thank you so much for bringing this important topic in today, Angela.
Thank you, Ralph.
And that's everything for Media in Check.